Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. This week on the Diverse Minds podcast, we're going to be talking about Eating Disorder Awareness Week. There are in fact 2 weeks allocated to raising awareness about eating disorders. One is the National Eating Disorders Association, running from the 24th of Feb to the 1st of March, and the second one run by Beat Eating Disorders from the 2nd to the 8th of March. Whichever week you choose, it's about challenging stereotypes. The National Eating Disorders Association, or NEDA for short, last year called their week Come As You Are. That was the theme in 2019. And the idea was that this was a movement towards inclusivity in the greater eating disorder community and unifying the field. The campaign expressed that regardless of your body shape, weight, race, gender identity, ability, region, religion, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, or stage of your body acceptance and eating disorder recovery, your story is valid and deserves to be heard. Building on last year's success and continued relevance, NEDA want you to come as you are again for their Awareness Week. And this is going to encourage the community to embrace this year's theme again, come as you are, hindsight is 2020, by reflecting on the positive steps that people may have taken, including those stemming from step-backs or challenges towards accepting themselves and others. The following week, Beat is campaigning against stereotypes and is highlighting the story of those who are not normally associated with eating disorders. Beat's chief executive, Andrew Radford, has said, "It is sadly not surprising that stereotypes about who gets an eating disorder are so widespread, but it is very worrying that those misconceptions are preventing people from seeking help. This means that Black and Asian minority ethnic groups, BAME, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and intersex, plus groups, and poorer people will get iller before they start treatment and find their recovery is harder." Eating disorders are serious mental illnesses that affect people of all ages, genders and backgrounds. We have to challenge the stereotypes and raise awareness so that everyone who needs help can get it quickly. And here are some statistics for you. Approximately 1.25 million people in the UK have an eating disorder. 1 in 5 females aged 16 to 24 has an eating disorder. Around 25% of those affected by an eating disorder are male. Research has shown that 20% of people living with anorexia will die prematurely from their conditions. Gay males are thought to only represent 5% of the total male population, but among males who have eating disorders, 42% identify as gay. Research has also shown that as early as 12, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, intersex and transgender teens may be at higher risk of binge eating and purging than their heterosexual and cis peers. Last year, in Eating Disorders Awareness Week, Beat found that nearly 4 in 10, or 39% of people, believed eating disorders were more common amongst white people than other ethnicities. Unsurprisingly then, BAME people feel less confident in seeking help from a health professional for an eating disorder than white people, with just over half, around 52% of BME respondents to the Beat survey saying that they would feel confident doing so compared with 64% of white respondents. Research has also found that nearly 30% of respondents believe people from affluent backgrounds were more likely to get eating disorders when actually eating disorders occur at similar rates across all income and education levels. And often when we think of eating disorders, something might pop into our head around bulimia and anorexia, and of course they are eating disorders, but this will also include things like binge eating, with no purging behaviours, excessive exercising and eating relatively normally, if you like, orthorexia, which is an obsession with quote-unquote clean eating, neurochondria, where people are very fearful of eating certain things for having an allergy, and eating disorders not otherwise specified, so it could be a mixture of things, and also bigorexia, which is generally more prevalent in males, but is a kind of muscular body dysmorphia. So it's important to think that eating disorders is a very big spectrum and how people are affected by it. Now, I'm really delighted to welcome Hope Virgo, my guest, to help us all understand more and know what to do for Eating Disorders Awareness Week. Hope Virgo is the author of Stand Tall Little Girl and an international multi-award-winning leading advocate for people with eating disorders. Hope helps young people and employers, including schools, hospitals and businesses, to deal with the rising tide of mental health issues which affect 1 in 4 people and cost employers between 33 and 42 billion annually. She's been described by Richard Mitchell, CEO of the Sherwood Forest Hospital, as sharing a very powerful story with a huge impact. Hope is also a recognised media spokesperson, having appeared on various platforms including BBC Newsnight, Victoria Derbyshire, Good Morning Britain, Sky News and BBC News. And for 4 years, Hope managed to keep it hidden, keeping dark secrets from friends and family. But then on 17th November 2007, Hope's world changed forever. She was admitted to a mental health hospital. Her skin was yellowing, her heart was failing, she was barely recognisable. Forced to leave her family and friends, the hospital became her home. Over the next year, at her lowest ebb, Hope faced the biggest challenge of her life. She had to find the courage to beat her anorexia. So I'm so delighted, Hope, that you've joined us today on the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, it's brilliant. And is there anything else you wanted to add in addition to the bio I've just introduced you with?
No, it's all good. Thank you.
All right, brilliant. So, Hope, you've published your book, Stand Tall Little Girl. How does sharing your story help others and yourself?
So, for me directly, I found writing my book really therapeutic, and it definitely helps me to manage my recovery in a really positive sense now. I think I feel, I guess, not pressure, but I do feel like a responsibility to stay well. So it means that if I'm having a bad day or something, I know that I have to get through that day in order to keep doing what I'm doing. And then more kind of about other people, I guess. The reason I wrote my book originally and started sharing my story was when I relapsed in 2016, I realized that there is a huge lack of understanding around eating disorders. I think people still think about eating disorders and think people have to be stick thin, and if they're not stick thin, they don't have an eating disorder. And so I wanted to write my book to basically educate people on actually what it's like to have an eating disorder, and to remind people that you have your kind of like long-term recovery, which will have its ups and downs, and it's okay to go through those periods where you're loving recovery, and then when there's other times when you're actually finding it more challenging, and actually making sure that people know that that is what it's actually going to be like, and that's what it will be like, but that the long-term goal is actually when you hit that real positive, that actually recovery really can be just amazing.
Oh yeah, thank you. And I think we talk about that when we do training, and the thing with physical health, and the example I always give is, has anyone broken their ankle? Not to out anyone, but obviously there are days when it's cold that you need to use the lift, that you can't use the stairs, and obviously mental health is exactly the same, isn't it?
No, exactly. And I think we do still hide so much of it. And I think, like, ironically for me, like doing what I do, I have to be so conscious of actually looking after myself much more so. And I do still struggle to have those, I guess, to talk honestly sometimes about how I'm really feeling, because I don't want to let anyone down and I don't want to be a burden. But the more we talk about it and kind of tackle that stigma that comes with it, the better it is, not just for us, but actually for everyone else around us.
And how did you start talking about your story? Because obviously, you talked about in 2007, you were admitted into mental health hospital, and it was a really dark time, really, really difficult. And how did you get to the point where you could start talking about it without being pulled back into those dark times?
So I guess I saw the bigger purpose of talking about it, which probably sounds a bit cheesy, but I realized that I didn't want anyone else to go through what I'd been through, and was so determined for that to happen that kind of trumped it all. So when my book came out, I started talking in schools, and did kind of various bits of work across the country with various schools. And then I realized that actually the more I talked about it, the more I was like enjoying actually being able to share this and having a platform to actually talk honestly about what mental health is and about the impact that it has on our lives, but also encouraging other people to open up. And I think it's that kind of keeps me going. When I first started doing it, I was really nervous about going into eating disorder units, because I was worried that I might be triggered. With anorexia, it's such a competitive illness that I have to be so mindful that I'm not going into units and then getting drawn back into like that competitive cycle. But what I have realized over the last kind of year and a half or so is actually I love I love doing that sort of work, because I think it's so important to give people who are struggling kind of like a bit of hope that actually they can recover too. And I think when I take myself out of the equation, it's more about, like, my purpose is actually more about actually making sure that people know what it's like to be in that situation. And particularly in hospital, I think you think that no one else understands what you're going through. And that's why I want to get myself in there and doing that, because actually I've been there, I know what it's like, and I know how difficult it is. But I do have to be careful, and I do still have therapy. And in my therapy sessions, we use that as a chance to actually talk in more detail about things that might have come up if it's challenged me a bit as well in the weeks of work.
Yeah, no, that's really, really powerful and really interesting to hear you say that. And again, hospitals, it's interesting, isn't it? Obviously, that's where people go. That's the system that we have, but often it can make people feel worse when it comes to mental ill health, mental health recovery.
No, exactly. And actually, interestingly, I was in a hospital recently, and a lot of the people who'd come into the hospital had picked up other habits. And I just thought that was ridiculous. Like, we do start to compete. And I remember when I was in hospital, every single mealtime would turn into a competition around who was eating what, whether people were leaving food on their plate. And you would just start to kind of like grate constantly on each other because you were competing all the time. And I think that's why so much of the work I do is actually around pushing for more community support, because yes, some people do need that hospital admission, but if we're focusing more on things like early intervention and preventing hospital admission, it is just better for everyone's recovery.
Yeah, and again, I think one of the interesting things, and given the theme of the eating disorder, the 2 weeks, is around challenging stereotypes, and who is the I'm using this crudely, but the quote unquote ideal candidate for an eating disorder, and what people might look like, and what people think of. The stereotype, isn't it, Hope, is of a upper middle class white woman who's very, very thin, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And you've developed the hashtag Dump the Scales campaign. So I think it'd be really interesting for listeners to hear about Dump the Scales campaign, and also how you've managed to get so much support for the campaign.
Yeah, definitely. So Dump the Scales launched about 1.5 years ago. And the reason that I launched the campaign was because when I relapsed, I got turned away from services for not being underweight enough. And the more I started sharing my story and talking about it, I realized that this isn't something that just happened to me, but it happens to so many people on a day-to-day basis. People who maybe are a healthy weight but struggling with that anorexic mindset and not able to get support, or people with bulimia or binge eating disorder. There's just not really as much access to services. And we do live in a society where we completely normalize disordered eating, and it means that people struggling with food just are unable to get that support. So the campaign is around calling on the government to make sure that the NHS guidelines around diagnosis are put into place properly, so that people aren't turned away from services because of their BMI. And it's also looking at GP training. So at the moment, GPs only get 2 hours of eating disorder training throughout their whole medical degree. And again, looking to change this so actually that everybody can get the right training they need, so that they can have those conversations as well. It has been quite a tough 1.5 years with the campaign. I think it got off to a very, very good start, and we made so much progress over the last year with ministers. We took the petition to Downing Street, and it's been really, really exciting. For me, at the moment, the biggest frustration is because of the general election that happened just before Christmas, and because I guess politics has been a little bit all over the place recently. It has been a little bit harder to actually engage with politicians and make sure that eating disorders remains on the agenda. But it is something that I'm constantly pushing, kind of constantly meeting with MPs and making sure the government are taking this seriously as well.
I know, it's brilliant, and I'm going to share your Twitter links, because again, you've got a really good Twitter page and you talk about a lot of the campaigning work that you do. And just on that note then about stereotypes, so let's say you as a colleague or a friend or a family member, that someone's weight wasn't dropping particularly, but you noticed they weren't really themselves, you noticed that their mental health and well-being wasn't optimum. How would you suggest that we start those conversations with people that we care about around mental health if we think they've got an eating disorder?
So I think it's really, really important, firstly, to realise and remember that when you say the word eating disorder, or when we say the word suicide or anorexia, we're not triggering someone. So they're not going to develop an eating disorder because we've talked to them about eating disorders. And I think because people are so fearful of doing that, It means that quite often we don't want to have those conversations. So what I always say is have a direct conversation at first. Go outside, go for a walk, go for a drive, and have that direct conversation, making sure that you're doing it away from a mealtime or not in a cafe or not kind of sitting down whilst you're trying to eat something together, but do it away in kind of like a safe environment. Sometimes that person will accept that they need that support, but more often than not, the person might get quite defensive. They might be in a bit of denial around it. They might not want to talk about it. And if that's the case, it's about going back to that individual a couple of weeks later and asking how they're feeling, asking what they've been up to, checking in with them, because it's important to remember that eating disorders are a secondary part of actually something else that's going on. It's an unhealthy coping mechanism to something that has happened in their life. And that's why we have to start talking about our feelings and actually what we're going through so much more. I also think it's worth just flagging that it's also really important to realise that it's not your job to fix that person. I think quite often, particularly when I'm in schools and in workplaces, actually, you have people who want to fix their colleagues or children who want to fix their friends, which is totally understandable because I'm probably very, very like that as well. I just want to fix everyone. But actually that individual doesn't want to be fixed all the time. And it's about walking alongside that person, reminding them that you're going to be there for them and actually being ready to listen whenever they want to have that conversation.
Yeah, and you're right, because I think when I do training as well, people say, but how do I get them to go to help? How do I get them to go to help? And I say, well, you can't. But what you can do is to say, right, I'm going to be with you. Here are your options. What else would you like to do? What could I help you with? And another thing we often talk about, and you must have seen this as well, is let's say the eating disorder starts from a diet, but obviously they've gone on a diet maybe, and then there's been some kind of challenge for them. And like you said, it's an unhealthy coping mechanism. But people will say, oh, you look great, you've lost weight. And another thing people say to me is, should you comment on people's weight at work? Should you say this? Should you say that? Will it trigger an eating disorder? And again, it'd just be really interesting to have your perspective on that.
So I don't think it triggers an eating disorder. I'm 100% sure of that. But I do think we should stop commenting on people's weights.
Yeah.
Quite often, I think we put so much emphasis on weight and particularly on weight loss. And we have this whole thing in society about if you're skinny, then everything's going to be perfect and that your life will be successful and it will just take away everything that's wrong. But actually the reality is that's not true. And quite often, if people are starting to diet and it's not for health reasons, then they have that potential to slowly get sucked into that negative mindset around dieting, around suppressing their feelings and their emotions. And they might be getting other things out of the dieting than actually losing weight. So my thing is we shouldn't comment on people's weight loss. We shouldn't comment on people who've put on weight or lost weight or whatever it is, but actually think about what that person might be going through and also focus on those other things instead. I know for me, when I was about 13, 14 years old, people would constantly be commenting on my weight change. And actually, it just gave me a bit of affirmation around what I was doing and made me feel better. And looking back, I wasn't even happy. Like the skinniest I was probably my least happy point, but I kept thinking it would get better. And because people didn't know how to have those conversations when I was growing up, no one knew what was going on. So I think actually we need to take a bit of responsibility and just be more mindful of those conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I had a conversation for one of the episodes on body positivity, and very similar. So Sarah Daisy Bernard was talking about the same thing, that should never ever comment on people's weight. So that's very helpful. And another thing is, in workplaces is particularly, I think it can be slightly different to the family or friend zone, if you like, is what if someone doesn't want help and they're becoming more and more ill? We don't know what to do. We don't know how to have the conversation. Do we inform their next of kin? And there's often quite a lot of panic about this, and I'm sure you will have seen this as well. So what are your top 3 tips for employers if someone is really struggling and they don't want to access support, but that they're not mentally very well at all?
I think you do have to contact their next of kin. I think that's really, really important. I think you need to remind that individual that that they can still do a good job, regardless of what the kind of is going on mentally for them. Because I think quite often when you're in a workplace, your biggest fear when you have a mental illness is that it will impact your career, that people will look down on you. And I think having that reassurance can actually help that individual to start to open up much more so. And I think also there is something I think which goes alongside this is actually just generally within workplaces is actually raising that awareness much more and actually making sure we're having more of those conversations. Because for people with mental illnesses, like I said, there is still a huge amount of stigma that comes with it. And it is our role and responsibility to try and challenge this and to make sure that people are getting that support. And the thing that is stopping people admitting they're struggling quite often is that stigma. It's the fear of them losing their jobs. It's the fear of them not getting a promotion or them not being given work to do in the day. And actually, if we can open up those conversations and have a frank conversation with an individual who is struggling, it will help that person feel much more assured about what they're doing. So I think, tell their next of kin, try and have a conversation with them, but also just make sure you're having those conversations which are reassuring them as well.
Yeah, and that's really useful because that is what I tell people. And I think, like you said, there's a lot of discomfort in this topic, and almost sometimes people feel like I don't want someone to think I'm telling on them, quote unquote, behind their back. But clearly, if you're really concerned about someone, that's why we have next of kin details, is to talk to people and to say I'm really concerned. But you're absolutely right to reassure someone that it's not about their job, that you make sure they're going to be supported with their mental health.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think sometimes we're so scared about what that individual will think of us.
Yeah.
Or we're so worried about losing someone as a friend. Yeah. And I completely get that because I've been there as well. But actually, if we don't say something and that individual gets in a worse state mentally or something happens to them or whatever it might be, actually then we'll feel more guilty about it. And in the long run, that person who we've suggested should be getting support, or if we've spoken to a next of kin about it, actually they will kind of thank us for it in the future as well once they've come through that. So holding on to that time and that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, thank you. And just speaking about stigma in workplaces then, what would you recommend? How could businesses and organisations get involved in eating disorder awareness weeks to break the stigma and to start this conversation in earnest, or to start removing some of the fear and the stigma around eating disorders?
So if you're an organisation that is fairly new to all of this, the things I would say is organise events to actually start that conversation. So run some lunch and learns throughout the week or throughout kind of the weeks in the year as well, to get people talking about eating disorders and more broadly on mental health. There is also something around your internal communications. So actually getting those speakers to maybe share a blog afterwards, or having your senior leadership team come forward and say they're supporting this week, this is why they're supporting it, and also sharing top tips in that sense. And then I think as well, just having more of those conversations around it and making sure that people are getting the support they need, to having the right signposting in place. I think that all organisations on their intranet should have something to do with mental health and should be talking more broadly around it, whether that is through making sure that you've got the signposts available, whether that's the top tips or blogs or whatever it might be, or having videos going out throughout the week. But if we get that buy-in from kind of the senior leadership team, then it also helps those people who are further down in their careers to actually start to talk about things and know that it's okay to talk about things.
Yeah, brilliant. Really clear, really simple, and actually very effective ideas, Hope. And if people want to work with you or get in touch with you, this is your sort of opportunity to say how you'd like to work with organisations and the work that you do. And I know you do a lot of keynote speaking. So any ways in which you want to be, the things you want to be doing in 2020?
So over the next year, my focus is around furthering the campaign, so looking at all the things around diagnosis, but also making that all frontline staff have an understanding around eating disorders, and that includes in the office as well, so including colleagues actually knowing how to start having those conversations and making sure that people are mindful about things. And whether it's people not commenting on food that people are eating or commenting on weight, I'm going to be doing a huge amount of work over the next year on actually getting all of those messages out there. So as you said, I do work with a huge number of corporates, but also with schools as well, around various workshops and running various sessions as well. And all of the information can be found on my website, which is www.hopevirgo.com. Or you can contact me as well on Twitter or across any of the social media platforms that I'm on as well. And I'd be more than happy to talk to you a little bit more about actually the work that I am doing that might be kind of, I guess, beneficial for your organisation. I think what I do want to kind of, I guess, I guess, kind of encourage is for us all to realise that actually we don't want to keep waiting for people to hit that crisis point. And yes, I know we talk about crisis a lot when it comes to mental health services, but actually that also includes in organisations as well. And actually organisations have a role within this to actually be helping to prevent people's mental illness and their mental health actually escalating out of control and getting to a point where they do need that support. So just working actually out what you can do as an organisation to start having those conversations around mental health is so, so important.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Hope. And I just think you've given such useful tips and really clear. So not to be afraid, to focus on how someone's feeling, to not do it around meal times, to let someone know that you're there, that you're going to, as you use the phrase, walk alongside them. It's not about forcing someone to get support. If things get really bad, in a workplace, you are absolutely within your rights to contact the next of kin sensitively in order for that person to get support. And actually, we just need to be talking about this all the time. And, you're absolutely right that we don't want things to hit crisis point. Sometimes that does have to happen, sadly. But if we're having these conversations all the time, we're enabling people to have light bulb moments or to think, is this the best coping strategy for me? What else could I do? How could I do it differently? And my employer's there to support me.
No, I agree. And I think also you've just made a really good point, actually, is that whole thing around actually for some people, they do have to hit that kind of crisis point. And the work that I do in schools, quite often you have parents or carers who are just so desperate, understandably, to actually work out what they can do for their young person to get that person to accept they need support. And the reality is, as you said, is some people have to hit that rock bottom. I think for me, in my illness, after kind of like living with it for kind of 3-4 years, there was probably nothing that anybody could say to me after that 4-year period which would have made me start to eat and start to accept that I had a problem until I got admitted to hospital and had that professional support. And I think it's so, so important to actually remember this and don't beat yourself up if you're supporting someone who's struggling and they won't have a conversation with you about it. And it's also, I think, about looking after yourself within that and not putting too much pressure on yourself to make those conversations happen.
Yeah. And so thank you again so much for your time, and everything's in the show notes. So I've included Hope's website, which is brilliant. I would absolutely have a look at that. And Hope's got some brilliant images on Instagram, and her Twitter's fantastic. I keep up with it. So you don't feel that you have to do everything, but it's really important that employers start the conversation about eating disorders. And Eating Disorders Awareness Week is a great platform for that. But of course, remember the 366 for 2020. How do you integrate this and drip feed it along throughout the year? And I just want to thank you again, Hope. And I know you'll be very busy for Eating Disorders Awareness Week, and I wish you all the best. And I'm sure lots of people will get in touch with you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
No, you're very welcome. Take care, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.